Welcome to this podcast edition called Cell Energy. I hope that you'll get a lot out of watching. The main goals for this podcast are to know that cells obtain, store, and use various forms of energy, beginning with sunlight. So as you see in this graphic, the flow of energy begins with the sunlight, and then it passes through this energy-rich molecule called glucose, and then ends up in our cells in the form of ATP. Also understand that plants contain chloroplasts, which are the site of photosynthesis. Furthermore, many organisms other than plants can perform photosynthesis, all of which produce the oxygen and complex energy that is needed for life. Thirdly, describe the two stages of photosynthesis and relate where the inputs and outputs for the equation connect. And then lastly, describe the structure and function of ATP, which is cell's main energy source. As we look at these 8 problems that cells solve, they're really the same thing that living organisms must tackle in order to survive on a daily basis. And so this focus of the podcast is to get the necessary food energy that is needed, and then also to obtain gases, whether it be plants taking in carbon dioxide gas or animals taking in oxygen. So those two are going to be focused on this podcast. Some words for you to be familiar with. Autotrophs are those organisms that can make their own food. So typically you might think of plants or algae. Heterotrophs are those organisms that have to consume other organisms for their energy. So they would be further up the food chain, beginning with at least an herbivore or a grazer like a cow or a deer. ATP is one form of the energy molecule that our cells need. ADP plus P sub I, as it's written, is the uncharged version. The charged version is ATP. And so through the process of photosynthesis and cellular respiration, ADP plus PI, which stands for inorganic phosphate, that's converted or connected to make an energy-rich ATP molecule. So I think of it as the uncharged versus charged version of a battery. When we get to thinking about photosynthesis, it's basically 2 reactions or stages. Sometimes they're called factory 1, factory 2. The first of those 2 is called the light-dependent reactions, and that's when sunlight energy is absorbed. And then the light-independent reactions, sometimes called the dark reactions, or sometimes called the Calvin cycle, that's the latter part of photosynthesis. So you put those 2 together, and you get the chemical reaction that occurs in the chloroplast of any photosynthetic creature. This is a really critical diagram for you to understand. It's basically demonstrating the circle of life. Just beginning at the top, we have the photosynthesis in chloroplasts. That's the absorption of light energy. It takes in carbon dioxide and water, and then that turns it into an energy-rich compound. Most frequently is glucose, and then it makes oxygen, which is the main contributor, perhaps the only contributor to the breathable oxygen in the atmosphere. So part 1 of this podcast series will focus on the top of that graphic. Part 2 will deal with the bottom half, but you definitely need to know the chemical reaction and the linkings between the top and the bottom reactions. So here we have our 3 parts to the podcast. This podcast, part 1, will deal with ATP and photosynthesis. Part 2, later on, will deal with cellular respiration. So a couple things to be familiar with ATP. As I said before, it's the most important energy molecule in the cell. It has a kind of a complicated structure, but essentially there's an instability with the molecule. It easily breaks down, so it's a little bit temperamental, and so we can use that tendency of this molecule in our cells to make things happen, from walking to thinking to digesting food. Every biological activity relies on ATP, and we need to have a lot of it in our cells. So it's very important that you understand how it's built and what does it do. So here we have the structure of ATP. I'll look into kind of the conceptual approach first. So according to biologyinmotion.com, we can look at ATP as kind of a charged or uncharged battery. You'll see here in this top view that the little cartoon featured on the top is the charged battery version. You'll notice it has the 3 red dots with a P on it. So that would be 1, 2, 3 phosphates or triphosphate. So the name ATP just comes from adenosine triphosphate. And then you'll see that the sad looking little cartoon creature is missing its last phosphate. So when it loses that phosphate, it reverts from a charged version to an uncharged version. Again, how do we get our energy? We get it through the foods that we eat. If we're heterotrophs, or if you're an autotroph like a plant, then you can make it through photosynthesis. So here's how that process works. Basically, there's this pathway of events that have to happen in order for something to occur in the cell. So it all begins with the food molecule. So imagine that we digest it. By digesting or breaking down that food molecule, you'll see that the ATP cartoon diagram has become sort of happy now that it's had the third phosphate added to it. And then when we break off that phosphate, you'll see that it does a job. So the word synthesis just means to bring together. So a lot of the growing and the repair work that's done in cells or your body are really synthesis jobs. And if you track it back to the top of this energy pathway, it doesn't happen without proper food. So we are what we eat. So if we talk about the structure of ATP, you'll see in this picture there's a blue double ring structure. That is what's called adenosine. It's related to the building blocks of DNA. Ribose is a form of sugar. That's the pink 5-carbon or 5-pointed structure in the middle. And then the phosphates, you'll see they toggle back between a 2-phosphate and a 3-phosphate position. You'll see that water helps to break that last bond. The thing that you'll notice with the P's, and it's not written here, is that they're a negatively charged atom. So it's taken on an extra electron. So they're negatively charged. They're anions, and negatively charged structures don't want to be too close to each other. So they're rather unfriendly partners. It's been described that the three of them are like three kids on a school bus that don't like each other, and one of them is going to get kicked off. And so you'll see that. And so as that energy bond is broken, you'll see that it releases a lot of energy for the cell to do its job. So again, that last phosphate, once it gets kicked off, the energy is released, and we have the energy to do the job of every bodily activity. So it cycles between two different conformations or positions. You'll see that in this top graphic, you'll see that there's 3 of these PO4s, and you'll see again they're all negatively charged. So again, the rule says that opposites attract and like charges repel, and so they don't want to be too close to each other. So that's what ejects that 3rd phosphate off there. And when that's ejected, then it is allowing the energy that's released to do cellular work. Ultimately, then it would become this ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. Di is actually Greek for 2. And then it gets recharged when energy from the sunlight or from our food is consumed, and then it's tacked on again. So just understand that there's that conversion between ATP, which is the energy-rich conformation or shape or position, and ADP, which is the energy-poor conformation. So that's basically what ATP is. It's a very common molecule. It's extremely important for you to understand what it is. And then that 3rd phosphate is really what the kicker is. It gets released with high energy also being released. Let's take a look at photosynthesis, which is one of the ways that ATP does get created. So understand that we all are on planet Earth, and we are alive due to the twin products of photosynthesis. First of all, there are energy-rich molecules, and then secondly, there's breathable oxygen. The atmosphere contains approximately 21% oxygen, about 77% nitrogen, and then there's some trace elements and other gases in the atmosphere. But that 21% oxygen is really, really, really key. So as the number of autotrophs decreases, then that's going to make it more difficult to take in CO2, which is linked to global warming, and also to make breathable oxygen. So plant a tree, or at least prevent trees from being torn down. That's kind of the motto. And understand that other things are made through photosynthesis. The cellulose that makes the bark of trees, makes the wood that wood-framed houses are built from. So there's a lot of structural materials that are made from cellulose. And then starch is basically a food sugar. It's a complex sugar that we get in things like bread and flour. So this is what it's all about. So you have simple sugars, which would include things like fruit sugar, which is fructose. It also includes things like sucrose, which is like table sugar. It makes complex carbohydrates like what you see this banana bread being made of. So again, that's the whole point of photosynthesis, is really to make energy not only for the plant but also for the animals that rely on the plants. One big misconception that I've come across is that it's only plants that do a photosynthesis, but you see by this graphic that it's actually lots of different organisms. So algae are marine plants. We have cyanobacteria, which are prokaryotic, and you'll see that they have a green kind of tint to them. What that means is they have green pigments that can absorb sunlight, so they absorb everything but green, essentially, and then they reflect just green. And so when you think about the spectrum of wavelength of light, you have RGB, red, orange, yellow, blue, green, violet, and so it's absorbing everything but green. So typically the colors that we see are the reflected colors, and everything else is absorbed. And then you see these purple sulfur bacteria. So again, they would absorb everything but purple, and they would reflect back purple. And then they have these one-celled protists, which are commonly associated with just pond water creatures. So this is your basic photosynthesis equation. And you look at the structure of this plant, this cartoon, and each structure contributes to this equation. So sunlight is absorbed by leaves, so they act as solar panels. The 6 carbon dioxide molecules are actually taken in by these breathing pores on the bottom sides of leaves. They're called stomates. Water is absorbed by the roots. Then we have the reaction arrow that yields the products. We have the oxygen is released from the same pores that the carbon dioxide is taken in. And then we have glucose, which is made in nearly all green tissue. And then in the summertime, when there's active growth, those sugars are used for plant growth. So those tend to be staying in the leaves and in the stems. But in the wintertime, for most plants that become dormant, the excess sugars that were produced during spring and summer and even into fall, they get stored in the roots. And so it's kind of their reserve or their bank for sugars. So where does photosynthesis happen? So it happens in chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are organelles found in plant cells. They're found typically in the leaves, but some plants will photosynthesize on their stem. They're green because they have a pigment called chlorophyll A and B, and those chlorophyll molecules absorb energy. You can think about this in a practical basis. If you wear a black t-shirt on a hot day, you get warmer than if you were to wear a white t-shirt. So by wearing that black shirt, the pigments that make it black absorb more energy than does a white shirt. The white shirt reflects all wavelengths. Black absorbs all. And so the green is just the only wavelength from the rainbow that is not absorbed, but rather reflected. And so the ultimate goal is to make sugar. And so this process requires a lot of energy, and so the sunlight provides that. We can think of photosynthesis in 2 stages. So the yellow box represents stage 1 or factory 1, and the black box represents factory 2. They have different names. Light dependent just means that light is absorbed and is necessary to do the job of factory 1. And then the second box is sometimes called the dark reactions because they can happen in the absence of sunlight. You'll see that there's a couple inputs and a couple outputs. You'll see that water is absorbed, CO2 is absorbed coming from the top of the diagram, and that oxygen is released, and a sugar is produced. So it's a pretty basic kind of 4-part reaction if you don't include light. So sunlight energy is trapped. That is turned into this energy-rich molecule called ATP. You have water that's split, comes in as H2O, and it leaves as O2. And then the remainder that's not found in O2 is actually retained by the chloroplasts, and it's used further down the line in this photosynthesis reaction. So these electrons, that's what's really scavenged from water. Very, very, very important to understand that electrons that form the bonds between molecules, those are the really, really money items. And so when we, for example, take a sugar molecule and turn that into energy, we're really breaking the bonds of the sugar molecules, snagging the electrons, and then using those for our own purposes. So it's really important to understand that electrons are really what this is all about. And in the dark reaction, we have ATP that powers the manufacture of glucose. So CO2 actually becomes part of a sugar molecule. And so that requires energy, and that energy is actually generated first in the light-dependent reactions, and then that energy is then transferred over to the dark reactions where the real construction of sugars occurs. So you'll see that as we look at the light-dependent reaction, there's this kind of, to me, they look like little pancakes or little heroes that are stacked one on the other, little discs. They're called thylakoids. And it's actually in the membrane of the thylakoid where the pigments exist, and you'll see that light is absorbed there, water goes in, O2 is released, and then you'll see that there's some transfer between the left hand and the right hand part of the diagram. And so what you see transferring from the light dependent to the light independent reactions are ATP, which are represented by that starburst that's partially in view, and then NADPH. So NADPH is actually kind of a taxicab, and it carries the electrons from the left-hand system to the right-hand system. And so NADPH is in two forms. When it has the electron, it's NADPH, and when it doesn't have the electron, it's NADP+. You can kind of make that out at the top of that diagram right about here. You'll see it's NADP+. That means that it's lacking an electron and it's going back to pick it up. So basically, let's summarize factory 1. So light is absorbed, so it's absorbed by pigments in the thylakoid membrane. Water is taken in by the roots. Water is then diffused, if you will, to the chloroplasts through the plant's structure. Water strikes, water is split when light strikes the thylakoid membrane, the surface of those green discs. Oxygen is released. So from the plant's point of view, it's a waste product. So good thing for us that we need that. Energy is made in the form of ATP. Electrons that are stripped from water get picked up by this electron shuttle or a taxicab, and then go on to the second factory. So let's kind of just stop and assess things for just a second. So 3 types of organisms that can do photosynthesis. Again, plants are kind of the common answer. It's a correct answer. Algae, some bacteria. There's more of them, but that's 3. The light-dependent reaction, or stage 1, happens in the chloroplast, but specifically in the membrane of these thylakoids. The reactants that go into the light-dependent reaction is water and light. And then the products that leave the light-dependent reaction is ATP energy, NADPH, which is the electron carrier or shuttle, and then oxygen. And then the location and the purpose of the stomata. Remember that on the undersides of all plant leaves, there is these breathing pores. And that's where the gas exchange occurs. So CO2 goes in and O2 goes out. And sometimes water leaves on a hot day, so they have to be careful that they don't lose too much water that way. So now we go on to the second stage. So photosynthesis just is implying that there's 2 parts to this process. So the synthesis means that energy that was produced in the light-dependent reaction, the left-hand reaction, is now going to be put to work. And so what does it do? It makes sugar. So that Calvin cycle, sometimes it's called the Calvin-Benson cycle, or there's other names for it. So CO2 is an input. It's added to the Calvin cycle. There's a lot of details that you don't need to worry about. And then out spits a CH2O, which is a generic form for a sugar. So when we think of C6H12O6, it's a 1 carbon to 2 hydrogen to 1 oxygen ratio, a 1:2 to 1 ratio. So step 1, we have our energy molecules, ATP and NADPH. They're carrying the energy and the electrons with which to make sugar to the Calvin cycle. CO2 is breathed in, so that's the raw ingredient for sugar. For every 3 CO2s that enter the Calvin cycle, they turn into 1 energy-rich glucose molecule. And then depending on what the plant's immediate needs are, sometimes it'll just use that glucose molecule right then as energy, since like animals, plants need energy for just the daily living, or it might store it for long-term use in starch or cellulose. So you'll notice that glucose is a monomer, it's a single unit, and the cellulose or starch can be tens to maybe hundreds of glucose units long. So sometimes they're stored for down the road, sometimes they're used to make new like stem material, bark, that sort of thing. So it all depends on what the purpose of the the reaction is. So let's take a look at the light-independent reactions. This is stage 2, what goes into it. So carbon dioxide enters from outside of the plant through the stomata. ATP and NADPH come from stage 1, the light-dependent reaction. The product is sugar, typically glucose. It can turn it into starch for long-term storage. The formula for glucose, you got to know that, is it's 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen, or C6H12O6. And then in terms of gas exchange, remember that stomata exist in the underside of the leaf. So that's kind of the big picture. So we have water and CO2 going in. You have O2 and sugar being produced. Light is what really kickstarts this reaction. It's sometimes called a catalyst. And you'll see that there's some internal sort of chemistry happening between the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. Essentially, the light reactions feed energy to the Calvin cycle so that they can even do their chemistry in the dark. Now, if you leave a plant in the dark for long enough, then the ATP and NADPH energy stores will drop to 0, and then the Calvin cycle stops. But you can run the Calvin cycle in the dark if you have enough energy. So that kind of sums up the podcast number 1. Again, understand that photosynthesis occurs in chloroplasts and also in some organisms that just have pigments, like cyanobacteria. Understand that cells obtain, store, and use these various forms of energy. It always begins with sunlight. Most organisms contain chloroplasts. That's the site of photosynthesis. Here the major focus was on plants. Other organisms, however, can make sugars and oxygen through this process. You saw how ATP was produced at in the process of photosynthesis. ATP is a very important energy molecule. It powers most cellular work. We would not be alive without it. So that's basically the wrap up. I appreciate for you joining in, and I'll see you next time.